no further ado, our guest speaker is Dr. Robert Perkins, and he is a professor of applied psychophysiology and expert on on trauma and stress, how trauma and stress affects the body. He's also a board certified expert in traumatic stress and is very well known in the field. And he's a well known instructor in the field of critical incident stress and trauma interventions. So, thank you, Dr. Perkins, for your time, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's it's a pleasure to be able to talk to all of you today. Some of you may be saying he's a professor of psychophysiology. What's psychophysiology? What's a psychophysiologist? I could spend the whole hour just talking about that. But the short answer to that is the field of psychophysiology is really, it's about that intricate relationship between the mind and the body. And unfortunately, in North America, we've developed a huge chasm when it comes to this. We're still operating on the sort of Cartesian model of health, which the mind is the mind, the body is the body. If I have an issue with my physical body, I'm going to see a physician. And if I have an issue with, any sort of psychological thing, then I'm going to go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And because we've created that divide, there really has been a lack of understanding. And I love talking to physicians. Most of my time is spent, especially in academia, in talking to mental health professionals, psychologists, and psychiatrists. In psychology, I don't really consider to be a science. It's a pseudoscience to me because there are no absolutes in psychology. So many things are interpretive. And to me, science is in absolutes. And so I love the opportunity of being able to talk with physicians today because you deal with absolutes. You deal with physical science. And so there's two things that I'm going to touch on today. It's my understanding that many of you are feeling sort of overwhelmed or feeling fatigued, both physiologically, psychologically, and likely emotionally. Perhaps it's the first time that you've ever felt this way. Many of you may have been doing this for a long time, some shorter than others, but for those of you that have been involved in this field before, in this occupation, which is no stranger to stress, some of you may be questioning, well, why? Why am I feeling like this? What is wrong with me? So I'm going to touch a little bit on that. The other thing that I'm going to touch on too is something that's made itself known in the last year. It's a new sort of mental health crisis that it's just scratching the surface now. But when the pandemic is finally under control, it's going to be something that the global population is going to be dealing with. And that's something that's known as post-COVID-19 traumatic stress syndrome. So first of all, so to those who are, feeling stress in their occupation that maybe that they've never felt before and are really questioning why, what is it that you're doing wrong, or what is it that you're doing differently? What's wrong with you? My first answer to that is that there is nothing wrong with you. I gave a talk not too long ago with some physicians, and one of these persons was a medic from Vietnam, and he said, I was a medic in Vietnam, and I'm feeling more stressed out now than I was when I was in combat. Why is that? Well, the short answer to that is, first of all, everyone here in this room is dealing with a situation that the world has never dealt with before, and that's the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly, we've had other pandemics, we've had SARS, we've had all of these other things, but there's never been a pandemic that's affected the entire global population like COVID-19. So really, even as professionals, we are in uncharted water. We don't have a manual that's going to tell us how to sort of respond, not only in protocols as far as dealing with your potential clients, dealing with colleagues, and dealing with your own sort of self-care. And what's really, really important to understand is this. You may have been doing this a very long time. You may have been a combat medic before you're in your role now, but at the end of the day, no matter how long you've been doing this, no matter how much stress and trauma that you've been exposed to up to this point in your career, one thing doesn't change, and that's the fact that you are a human being. And every human being has a limited capacity as far as how much stress and trauma they are able to sort of hold on to at sort of one time without having some mechanism to process it. And when we become overwhelmed with stress and trauma, what happens? Well, essentially, the check engine light in our car, it comes on in our body. And it comes on in our body by manifesting itself through physiological symptoms, through emotional symptoms, and through psychological symptoms. And so, what's really important to understand is that when we're experiencing these difficulties, these symptoms, these signals of distress, this is a normal reaction to a very abnormal set of circumstances. The amount of stress and trauma that's been created by COVID-19 for the general population is astronomical, let alone those who are working in the healthcare field. And healthcare field workers, they have added dimensions of all of the stress and trauma that affect us. But it's very, very important to understand that when we get exposed to stress and trauma, just because we're physicians or we're mental health practitioners or perhaps we're paramedics or first responders, it doesn't mean that we're immune from those effects. What's happened and what we've developed over our career is the ability to temporarily suppress reactions to stressful situations and to trauma to allow us to be able to do our job. For example, a paramedic is dispatched to a terrible car accident, and perhaps in this accident, one of the patient's arms has been amputated, and the arm is laying there, and there's blood everywhere. If you were to take your average civilian and put them in that situation, their reactions could be they could just become hysterical because they've never seen such a gruesome sight. They could have they could start vomiting because they've never seen that sort of physical trauma. But the reason that paramedics and firefighters and police officers and doctors, the reason that they don't have those same physiological responses, such as vomiting or such as sort of being overcome emotionally, is because that we've conditioned ourselves. We're able to press the pause button on physical reactions, emotional reactions, and psychological reactions for us to be able to do our job, to get our job done. Now, once our job is done, it doesn't mean that magically that situation is just gone. It's still there. And each one of us will have, I hope, would sort of have a process for being able to sort of deal with stress and trauma. Because if we don't, and it just sits there, we are going to have to deal with it at some point in our life. And when we get exposed to stress and trauma, really, I like to equate it to borrowing money from the bank. So if I borrow $1,000 on a Monday and I pay it back on the Friday, I'm going to pay that $1,000 and I'm going to pay a very small amount of interest. However, if I borrow that $1,000 and I wait a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, I still got to pay that principal, but I'm going to pay a significant more interest. And stress and trauma is the same way. What happens is that interest that accumulates, it accumulates in the amount of resources and the amount of time that's required to be able to sort of process that trauma. And to give us an idea just how stress and trauma sort of affects us, I'm just going to show a little diagram here. Just bear with me. All right. So stress and trauma affects everybody differently. But the bottom line is this. In 1676, Hooke's law of stress was established. And Hooke's law of stress is essentially defined as a phenomenon in physical science, whereas the presence of a load or physical stress was capable of causing a physical strain on any given material. Now, if you listen to that, I mean, that could be an engineering principle. If you take a thin piece of wood and you put two heavy rocks on it and you hold it up, it's going to break. Where there is a load or whether there is a physical stress, is going to cause strain. And so an Australian endocrinologist by the name of Hans Seil identified what he believed was a consistent pattern of mind-body reactions, which he called the non-specific response of the body to any demand. And the Seilian tradition is the term used to describe this non-specific response to the body. And so here we have a stimulus and a response. We have a stressor, psychosocial event, and that has in turn caused a stress response. However, mental and physical stress are considered to be equally applicable in the Seilian notion. And we have to understand that stress is a mind-body, so again, that sort of psychophysiological connection, response, which mediates between the stressor stimuli, which is a set of conditions or psychosocial events, and a stress-related target organ disease. And so what he describes is if we have the stressor, we have the stimulus, so we can think of that as being sort of COVID-19, and then our body is going to create a stress response. And in that stress response, we have two choices. There are two things that can happen. We can have a coping mechanism or a process to deal with that stress, or we can't. And what you'll see here is when we don't, here we have the stress response, environmental event or the psychosocial event, which we'll call COVID-19. We call that the stressor. There's a process of cognitive interpretation. So we see we're dealing with this situation and we're going to assign meaning to it. We're going to assign emotion to it. And based on what we assign to that or to the individual stresses and traumas we're dealing with on the job, we're going to have what's called affective integration. This is what our emotional arousal is from dealing with this particular incident. And it's that that's going to determine our stress response. And when that stress response is determined, there are two strategies here. Number one, our body is going to be out of homeostasis, okay? And there will be a drive within our physical body to return to homeostasis. It wants to get back to sort of normal. And if we have a coping mechanism, we can return to homeostasis quite easily over time. However, if we don't have a coping mechanism, then what happens is that stress response that's been activated, we get excessive activation. And we know that that excessive activation will lead to what we call target organ dysfunction or stress-related disease or dysfunction. Now, we know that 70 years ago, people who were practicing physicians, when it came to ulcers, probably, 70 years ago, ulcers was really the only sort of interaction a physician had when it came to talking to their patient about any sort of issue in respect to mental health, talking about their feelings and those sort of things. And it was not something that physicians like to do. Why? Well, physicians are scientists. We're dealing with science. All of a sudden you bring in the realm of mental health. And so here you would have, people that were suffering from ulcers, and their doctors are telling them, well, what is your stress level like? What are your feelings? It made them feel extremely uncomfortable. And this is a new concept. It wasn't really received well by the patients. In 1980, a bunch of researchers and scientists, they said, aha, stress has nothing to do with how ulcers are caused. Ulcers are caused by bacteria, the specific strain of a bacteria in the human body. And in the 80s at that time, all of these physicians says, oh, thank goodness, this is great. I can stop having to talk to my patients about their feelings and focus on their sort of physical health. Well, 12 months didn't go by until those different group of researchers identified, well, wait a minute here, because now we have figured out that, when the body is exposed to stress, guess what happens? Our immunity level goes down. And when our immunity level goes down, we're more susceptible to that bacteria, which in turn can cause those sort of ulcers. So, stress and trauma, extremely important. Mental health and physical health, extremely important. They're two different things, but they're equally as important because we know that there are things within the physical body that can cause psychological difficulties. And likewise, there are things in the psychological body that can cause physical difficulties. And one of the things about mental health, mental health practitioners, psychologists and counselors, here is the only, I will put them in the same category as a health practitioner. Here's the only health practitioner that doesn't take an X-ray or an MRI of the part of the body that they're treating. Can you imagine someone coming in with a broken leg or a broken arm, and you're just kind of like looking at it and go, well, it looks like it might be broken. The person is acting in the amount of pain that they're in, that they're broken, and it probably is broken. Of course not. That would be ridiculous. We need to see via MRI, via X-rays. We need to see what's going on with this organ. And yet, in mental health, and the organ that we're treating is the brain, most practitioners, we're not doing brain specs, we're not doing brain scans. And this is something one of my colleagues, Dr. Daniel Amen, was very adamant about, and explaining that, there are physical conditions of the brain that can be identified in linking psychological conditions. And one of the issues too has been very unsuccessful methods of treatment. Now, the one thing that I left out in that conversation, talking about, we know that ulcers are caused from a bacterial infection. When that took the strain off of the sort of physicians in sort of having to deal with patients and their feelings and stress, guess what happened? Now it became a totally pharmaceutical cure, and boom, that went out. And the problem with specifically with mental health is that's also become a pharmaceutical cure. We know that we have very limited success in treating things like post-traumatic stress disorder and things of that nature based on the set of parameters that we're using. And what's lacking in these issues is the lack of new ideas. We're holding to things that, we've been doing for, 70, 100 years. Maybe they don't work very well, but we don't have anything else to sort of use. And so what needs to be done is we need to really break that chasm between physical health and mental health, and understand that physiologically, when physicians, when first responders, even military and police people are exposed to stress and trauma, it's going to affect them. And the biggest way that the field of psychophysiology is able to help people is it uses psychoeducation. So we're not taking these people in sort of modalities of therapy. Essentially, what we're doing is we're giving them an owner's manual to their own body, and explaining why they are responding the way that they are. When a person is exposed to stress and trauma, there will be a wear and tear effect on the human body. And we each have a limited capacity. Now, some of us can take more stress and trauma than others, but at the end of the day, it's going to affect you. And when it does affect you, the most important thing to understand is this is a normal reaction to a very abnormal set of circumstances. Many people who've never experienced these levels of stress, and thus they're experiencing psychological, physiological, and emotional symptoms, they're like, something is wrong. I've never felt like this. I've been a physician for a very long time. Something's wrong. Perhaps I'm broken. And that sort of will begin to turn like a hamster wheel in that person's mind. Normalcy, understanding that you guys deal with enormous amounts of stress and trauma on a daily basis. And in order to still maintain being a human being, that's going to affect you. I would be more worried about people that are going through everything that you're going through now, combined with the pandemic, that weren't having any problems. That can be a serious difficulty, because just like I said that we have the ability to press the pause button. And normally we just deal with a stressful situation. The pause button is on. We take the pause button off, and sort of our life will go back to normal. We may feel a little bit stressed. We may feel that stress as sort of fatigue or what have you, but we still feel it. And if there was a difficulty, if there was something sort of so traumatic, that check engine light would come on. And what do you do when the check engine light comes on? You don't throw the car away. You take it to somewhere that needs that attention to return it to its optimal performance. What we're seeing right now with healthcare workers, with first responders within the pandemic, is they're suffering from something that's known as homeostatic inertia. And homeostatic inertia is where we press that pause button, and that pause button, it just stays on, right? And it's very easy to deal with stress and trauma when the pause button is on, because I'm not getting any physical reactions. I'm not getting any emotional reactions. And certainly I'm not getting any sort of psychological reactions. So in the absence of those reactions, I'm not getting a stress response. Thus, it's not creating any sort of symptoms or signals of distress. what happens when we leave that pause button on is it creates the illusion that everything is okay with our mind and our body. And we know from that diagram about what happens when we're not processing stress or deploying a coping strategy properly is that it will lead to target organ activation and target organ disease or dysfunction. So normally we would get these signals of distress, we would get these symptoms that would say, hey, something's wrong and we need to sort of figure out what that is. We need to deploy a tactic that's going to be able to address it. But when we don't have those, when our pause button is still on, what happens is we don't get those signals of distress. And now that stress reaction will manifest itself into organ dysfunction or disease. And when that happens, the amount of time and the amount of resources necessary to correct it is significantly different. So it's important to understand what's just sort of some of the basic stress responses are of stress and trauma and how it affects us. And really, this all comes down to fight or flight. And I'm sure everybody understands the basic concept of fight or flight. It was something that Walter Cannon came up in the First World War, where he was identifying, watching fighter pilots. And at some point in time, you would see the two planes that would become closer. And at some point in time, they would either engage in combat or they would pull back. And we know that that sort of fight or flight response is present in the human body. And when fight or flight is engaged, there are things that are going to happen. Fight or flight is triggered in the adrenal gland. And we know the adrenal gland is just either the two dissimilarly shaped endocrine glands, one's above each kidney, consisting of the cortex, which secretes several steroid hormones, and the medulla, which secretes epinephrine, also called the supernal gland. Epinephrine is a hormone that's secreted by the adrenal medulla that's released into our bloodstream and in response to physical or mental stress, as from fear or injury. And when this happens, it initiates many bodily responses, including the stimulation of heart action, increase in blood pressure, metabolic rate, blood glucose concentration, as well as adrenaline. And adrenaline, we know, is a chemical that's released into the body that affects the individual's blood pressure, nervous system, bodily temperature, digestive system, and other physiological responses of the body. Epinephrine and norepinephrine affects that feelings part of the body in our brain, which includes our ability to regulate things such as fear and anger and joy. So what I'm saying is that whenever we start to experience let's take emotional symptoms. Perhaps people are very edgy or angry or sad. Perhaps you're snapping at your spouse or you're snapping at your coworkers, and just sort of afterwards you go, "That's not my normal behavior. Why am I doing that?" It's important to understand that when we're in stress and traumatic situations, these chemicals will be released into our body. And some of these chemicals affect the part of our brain which gives us the ability to regulate our emotions. And so when we understand that, okay, you know what, this is not my normal behavior, but this is why it's happened. It's a physiological response because of the situation that we're in. And as physicians, you're not immune to physiological, psychological, or emotional responses to trauma. So having an understanding, and when we feel ourselves being fatigued or we're identifying these signals of distress that are happening in our lives, just remember this, is that, COVID has been going on for a year. And to a civilian, people are being extremely traumatized from everything from the lack of social interaction to having to wear a mask, to the fear of contracting the virus, to the fear of passing it on to family members, to the lack of all of the things that provide a balance in our life, from practicing our faith in our places of worship, to being able to go to the gym and work out, to be able to socialize, to go to all of these things have been taken from us. So it's not just, COVID has not just created one single stress. Oh my goodness, we're in a pandemic. No, it's all of these multiple layers of stress upon layer, upon layer, upon layer. Many people who are working from home they've never spent this much consistent time with their spouse or their children in their entire lives. This is new to them. Now they're trying to work from home and the kids aren't going to school. And then you just, on top of that, the financial implications and how it's affected. It is a huge thing. The world has never dealt with such an issue as COVID-19. And mark my words, if you want to fast forward 5 years from now, more people will have died from committing suicide as a result of stress and trauma from COVID-19 that will have ever died from the virus. It's going to create a huge, huge, huge challenge for the global population that, when we have the great reset, and everybody talks about going back to normal, there's no going back to normal. There's the new normal. Things will never be normal again. But when we establish that new normal, at the beginning, there's going to be this sort of misconception. COVID is over. I don't have to wear a mask. I can go to the gym. I can go to the restaurant. Everything's going to be great. And people are going to go back to work and it's going to be great for about the first 2 or 3 weeks. But after that, what's going to happen is these symptoms of stress and trauma are going to start to show themselves in the workplace. And it's going to be a huge issue. Now, you came here for some good news. I'm painting a pretty bleak picture. This is the way that it is, though. But what's important to understand is all of the things that all of you guys have been struggling with. You're human beings. You're normal. You have to look at how many complex layers of stress and trauma COVID has brought to your profession. Your profession, on a good day, is extremely stressful and brings to it stresses and traumas that really aren't necessarily recognized in other workplaces. But very briefly, I'm going to touch about post-COVID traumatic stress syndrome and what it is. So essentially, post-COVID traumatic stress syndrome is caused as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. It has 4 distinct groups of victims. It has multiple traumatic events stemming from an original traumatic event. And of the 4 group, each group will share common traumatic events, but each of the own groups will have their own distinct traumatic events. And as well, each group will have their own dominating symptoms as well as common symptoms shared with other groups. And this has a potential effect on the entire global population. Now, the pathology of PCTSS is very simple. There was the event, there's the outbreak of COVID-19, and people will be identified into whatever the particular group distinction they're in. Now, one of 2 things generally will happen. There will be some groups that are going to have to sustain self-isolation. There will be other groups that would have to continue to work, and all of you would fall into the continue to work. And based on that, people will experience physiological and psychological symptoms as a result of that, or they may fall victim to that homeostatic inertia I was talking about, when the sort of pause button is on and we think, hey, everything is okay, we're plowing along as normal. There's going to be a cost to pay at the end. The groups of PCTSS are this. We have primary populace essential service workers, which would be you. We have students and teachers, and then we also have confirmed COVID-19 victims. But essential services workers includes any person who continued working in the general public environment during the COVID-19. It includes police, fire, EMS, medical, hospital staff, and military, as well as retail and service workers within fields that were deemed by governments as an essential service. So I'm going to just quickly come to your group so that you have an understanding of sort of the different stresses and trauma that your particular group would have been subjected to. So when we look at stress and trauma when it comes to COVID-19, we think about the virus, we think about sort of self-isolation, but it's important to look at all of these things. Within essential workers, we got 2 subgroups: emergency service and medical essential workers, and the non-emergency. And we know everyone here is included in the emergency services and medical. So with this group, there are 4 major trauma stimuluses associated with the essential work. There's COVID-19 trauma, there's the additional workload trauma, there's isolation from family and friends trauma, there is physical and psychological exhaustion trauma, and there is financial impact trauma. this trauma, COVID-19, is a similar, it's found in all of the groups. And this is broken down into the fear of contracting the virus, or fear of family or friends contracting it, and fear of death if the virus is contracted. This particular stimulus is the most powerful as the issue at hand is not still really not isolated. It's international global pandemic that's affecting all people. And it is intensified daily by the constant media reporting both accurately and inaccurately the current situation and forecasting what the best and the worst case scenario could be for the future. When we turn on the TV, when we watch the news, the fact that we're hearing this all of the time, every day, with no definitive answer. I mean, we've got to the vaccine stage now, but we're still dealing with this. There's really no sort of hope. But we're getting that reinforced every single time we put the news on. It becomes an even greater trauma for this group as the risks are significantly higher for individuals for exposure to trauma, specifically in emergency services and medical staff, as they may be in contact directly with individuals who have been confirmed as having the COVID-19 virus. The second subgroup also shares a higher fear factor, although not as excessive as the first group, due to the fact that they will also have a greater risk of contracting the virus because of the number of people that they're being exposed to, specifically those who are in the sort of retail and the service end. Now, the fear of contracting COVID-19 will be so great, it will also have a ripple effect on their ability and their wanting to interact with friends and family, save they expose them to any potential virus that may have been passed through their interaction with the public or through your jobs. As governments begin to impose restrictions on mobility and travel, and a secondary fear of loss of freedom can also begin to build. And additional fears initially that we saw of shortages of food and just our general fear of personal safety all fuel the ever-building COVID-19 trauma. Now, individuals in both of these groups are also experiencing the feelings of the stress of being in a higher risk environment, of getting COVID-19. As well, they're going to be subject to a much higher workload and pace of work than they are used to. Pressures from their workplace of additional or sort of non-traditional hours of work, limited breaks, limited time off, canceled vacations can make a difficult job even more difficult. Emergency services personnel will also begin to experience an increased call volume, a lot of which will result from psychosocial and physiological and psychological dysfunctional behavior from the general public who are beginning to feel and manifest the symptoms of not being able to adequately cope with the stress they're under. Initially, safety equipment, things like masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, they may be in short demand or may not have been a usual piece of safety equipment used by the employer, for example, in retail employees. And the fear of not having them combined with the resentment for their employer for not providing them can start to begin to build a toxic work environment. And the cumulative stressors, the inability to have meaningful social and intimate relationships with others due to social distancing, hours of work, or just lack of energy, can also create a sexually hostile workplace. And men and women who normally would never exhibit any behavior that would violate a traditional workplace harassment or sexual harassment policy under extreme stress may begin to show a lack of primal needs being fulfilled, and primal instincts may be expressed negatively in the workplace between genders and same-sex employees. Again, behavior that is not normal. And when these things happen, it's very important to understand this hasn't changed our character. We are still the same person that we are. It's just our normal behavior has been altered because of the sort of stress that we experienced in this situation. So another very important stressor that we have to understand is this isolation from friends and family. Although not subject to the mandated self-isolation as many of the other groups because of your work is deemed to be essential, there may be isolation by their own intentions or the intentions of others from friends or family. So many will fear the risk of passing something to family or friends, especially people who are working in ER or are working in frontline services that are dealing with COVID-19 patients. They may choose to isolate themselves. While many family and friends fearful of contracting the virus will isolate themselves from you. This in itself can cause emotional trauma. as the feeling of caring relationships and the social interaction associated with those relationships may have been in the mind of these people their only coping mechanism and able to deal with this current situation. All of a sudden, people have lost a very important aspect of dealing with stress and the ability of sharing that struggle with friends or family, or the distraction of the trauma by enjoying socializing activities. And with the onset of social distancing being the requirement of staying a recommended distance from other individuals and limiting gathering into groups, this makes it almost impossible to experience group social experience, as well as it eliminates the ability for people to practice their faith at a place of worship. And additionally, practicing social distancing will create a lack of physical touch, which can have a profound effect on the psyche of an individual and actually contribute to psychological and physiological issues within the human body. Touch deprivation, also known as skin hunger, has within its own scope of symptoms, including aggressive behavior, body image issues, high stress levels, loneliness, depression, sexual dysfunction, fear of attachments, and unsatisfying relationships. And we know that the simple act of giving a hug has been found to increase the production of oxytocin in humans. And this is the hormone that positively influences our bonding and our nurturing behaviors. Major sporting events in terms, which also are a stress buffer for many people, whether attending the game in person or watching it on TV or at a bar with friends, this has all been suspended during the crisis. And all of these seemingly minor things that people are conditioned to enjoying and subconsciously are their ways of maintaining balance of stress incurred in both their personal and professional lives have simply vanished. Besides not having the ability to enjoy the things people usually do and the freedom of mobility and experiencing that social interaction, there's also issues of confinement. And many couples are not conditioned or have ever spent this much consecutive time together. It's going to put a strain on their marriages during this time. And similarly, with school being canceled, many parents are not used to having children in the home for this much time. It will create strains on relationships, not only between spouses, but also children and any other extended family member that's living in that same residence. And on top of that, we get into physical and psychological exhaustion trauma. So, for many workers in emergency services, an increase in work and an increase in stress is something that's familiar to them, albeit not to the same level that COVID-19 crisis has brought. However, they have been subject to these conditions that have forced themselves to adapt and be able to condition themselves to work in this environment to what people are used to being exposed to, but for a shorter period of time. They develop the ability to suppress psychological responses and even physical responses in order to carry on the task at hand in almost a virtual autopilot mode. Now, normally, when the situation is back to its normal pace, these individuals are going to have a mechanism in processing the physical and mental energy expended and return to a normal homeostasis in their body and in their workplace. The demands that have been placed on so many individuals during COVID-19 are so great and for such longer periods of time than they're accustomed to, they risk that autopilot being a continual function, which can lead to something that's called homeostatic inertia. The body and the mind both know what is normal and what is abnormal conditions, and there is a utilitarian function to push towards balance or homeostasis, either by natural physical function to adjust through symptoms to alert an individual that something is not balanced or needs attention. Homeostatic inertia happens when a person has been functioning in autopilot for so long that their body ceases to attempt to create the balance of that person. And that person becomes immune to the body's signals of distress in trying to communicate that restoration of normal function or homeostasis that's required. So the symptoms of psychological or emotional exhaustion can be both physical and psychological, and they include things such as lack of motivation, feelings of hopelessness, change in appetite, difficulty concentrating, trouble sleeping, absent-mindedness, nervousness, increased cynicism, irritability, apathy, depression, sense of dread, physical fatigue, headaches, irrational anger, and increased pessimism. Then there's the financial impact trauma. You say, well, how has COVID impacted me financially? I haven't stopped working. I'm actually probably working more. Well, believe it or not, even through essential workers have not lost their stream of income. In many cases, they have increased income they were bringing in as a result of overtime, additional days off, This can create financial impact trauma. First, it can create frustration in seemingly working harder and beginning to get more money, but not having the time or the ability to be able to spend that money due to the fact that many businesses have shut down. It also may propel an individual into a different tax bracket and deduction bracket that will require them to pay additional taxes and this will offset their entire tax year, causing them to lose previously entitled deductions that were based on their averaged income. As well, the risk of becoming accustomed to the added income when things go back to normal and suddenly it stopped may create hardships to adjust back to what their normal stream of revenue was before the COVID-19 crisis started. Now, the reason I'm sharing this with you is that I want you to see, and that's just scratching the surface of some of the complex layers of trauma that have been associated with COVID-19. When you pour all of those together, it's like this perpetual pressure cooker. And when's COVID going to be over? We don't know yet. We have a path. We believe that this vaccine is going to have a significant effect on the pandemic. We don't know that for sure, but that's what science has told us, and that's sort of what we're banking. But we still don't have these dates, so we don't have a date in end. We know that, you know what, on July the 16th, things are going to go back to the new normal. We don't know that, so we're still struggling daily, having to deal with all of these sort of things. So, having said all of that, well, what is the solution? Well, first of all, the solution is number one, you have to be aware of the fact that everyone here is a human being, that everyone here is still going to feel the effects of stress and trauma on their body. And when you do feel them, you have to be able to know that, first of all, you're not broken, you are normal. This is a normal reaction to an abnormal set of circumstances, being the stress created from COVID and all of the things associated with that. Number two, you have to figure out what it is that's going to bring you back to homeostasis. Everyone has to have that sort of stress busters, has to have something that you deploy that's going to ground you, that's going to bring you back to your baseline. Many people will say, well, my work is such in demand, I don't have the time to be able to do that. Well, it's actually your mental health is more important to get that grounding and to take that time off, because if you carry on and you break, then you're not going to be of any use to anyone sort of in your workplace. So both individuals and the company itself, from an HR perspective, from an operational perspective, they have to provide what we'll call a psychologically safe workplace, where when someone is, when you're just at your end and you know you're at your end, you have to feel safe enough and comfortable enough to tell your superior, to tell your manager, I have to take a day or I have to take the afternoon off. You have to recharge, because your own physical and mental health is of utmost importance, and that will decide whether or not you're going to be able to continue to have the ability to help others. So creating this psychologically safe workplace is a relatively new concept. Now, I'm originally from Canada, and Canada is the first country to actually establish a national standard of psychological health and safety. We all know what industrial health and safety is. If you work on a construction site, there are rules. I have to wear steel-toed boots. I have to wear a hard hat and things of this nature. These are the laws that they have to be adhered to. And what they've done in Canada is, just as they have those industrial health and safety standards, they've created psychological health and safety standards that are being implemented within businesses. And what many businesses are doing is they're appointing an individual in their organization to be sort of the champion of this. And they're designating them as what's called a chief mental health officer. It's not a mental health professional. It's just someone who takes responsibility for sort of assessing, creating the conditions and the sort of policies and procedures that are going to provide that psychologically safe health and safety in the workplace. And I'm just going to show you a very, very short video that sort of describes that technique that I'm talking about.
No other field makes an impact quite like healthcare, Every day, healthcare workers dedicate themselves to providing quality care and making an impact in the lives of their patients, their families, and the communities they work in. But the things that make healthcare so rewarding can also be what make it a particularly challenging environment. Between the long hours and high pressure, healthcare workers experience higher rates of burnout, compassion fatigue, and sleep deprivation. Because of this, they are more likely to miss work due to illness or injury. When healthcare workers experience mental health issues, the consequences are felt on a broad scale. Their lives and the lives of their families are impacted. Other workers can feel more pressured, and the work environment can become less safe. This can impact quality of care and the patient experience. How can healthcare workers care for others when they themselves feel unwell? While individuals are responsible for their own health, organizations have a key responsibility in the promotion and protection of a psychologically safe workplace. Changing the work culture to ensure psychological health and safety is given the same importance as physical health and safety isn't just the right thing to do. It can help reduce costs and impact the financial bottom line. It can prevent stigma and discrimination. Most importantly, it can help employees work safer, perform better, and feel happier. Because there is no health without mental health. It's a journey that will look different for each organization, and everyone has a role to play. There are several ways to get started. Take a look at what your organization is already doing. Most workplaces have existing policies and procedures in place to support psychological health and safety. Consider taking part in training opportunities like mental health first aid or anti-stigma programs. Involve your staff in the process and communicate the plan, its purpose, goals, and overall benefits. It's time for the healthcare sector to become leaders and role models in promoting psychologically healthy and safe work environments for all Canadians. Join the movement. Be a health leader.
So again, there are some reactive things that we can do in dealing with how this has affected our bodies, but there are also some proactive things that we can put into place that can prevent and mitigate some of the responses that we experience. The ability to be able to talk about it, whether it doesn't have to be, you don't have to go to a mental health professional. Even just creating a group of your peers or identifying people that are saying, you know what, I'm willing to sort of be part of a peer support group when people feel that way, is a huge impact. Boscarino was they did some research after the World Trade Center attacks. And what they did was they researched all of these frontline individuals that were stressed and traumatized from their interaction and having to deal with that. And what they did was they measured the success of the impact with people that were going to mental health professionals and people that were getting that support from peer support groups. And what they found was people that were getting the help from peer support far exceeded the impact. It helped them much better than those that were seeing sort of mental health people. So having that ability and creating an atmosphere, creating an environment where we say, listen, we're humans, we're doctors, but we're humans and we're dealing with some really bad stuff. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we have such a hard day. It's hard to get out of bed the next day and go. Having the ability to say that and creating a structure within your organization that's going to promote psychological safety, that's going to give you something such as a peer support group. I know that Marketplace is involved in your organization. Marketplace, people like Hector, these people are trained in trauma interventions such as critical incident stress debriefing. Critical incident stress debriefing, I mean, there will be scales of trauma that you deal with. And if we sort of say 1 to 10, but sometimes the things that goes the 9 or the 10, doesn't matter if you're a doctor, it affects you. And when you've been exposed to something really terrible like that, the ability to go through a critical incident stress debriefer is extremely beneficial, because what it does is it prevents that trauma from just sort of sitting in the back of your brain and accumulating interest. And it successfully mitigates the impact of that trauma. It doesn't eliminate it, but what it does is many people, when they're exposed to terrible trauma, it paralyzes them. So it prohibits them from being able to do the things in their professional life and in their personal life that they were able to do before the trauma. When a person goes through critical incident stress debriefing, it mitigates those factors. So it doesn't erase the situation or the memory, but it normalizes it and allows you to carry on to be able to do your job. And it also promotes the cohesion of the group within your sort of employ. So it's extremely important to, number one, to be aware of how COVID-19 and all of the multiple stressors are affecting you every single day, both on the job and off the job. Number two, we always say, in case of emergency, break glass, right? You know, we see a fire extinguisher or a fire alarm. Everyone should have that, but you need to ask yourself, what is under that glass for you? When I'm feeling to the point where I'm just ready to snap or break down, and I break that glass, what's in there for me? Is it somewhere place I'm going? Is it a friend that I'm calling? Is it a colleague? We need to know that. And we need to have programs in place that are going to provide that psychological and emotional support and safety for you to be able to do your job effectively and long after COVID is over. It's very, very important to have these things in place. And that's really all I've got. If anybody has any questions or wants to make any comments, I certainly welcome them. Don't everybody speak at once. I mean, that's just rude.
Thank you. This is really useful. I think it's a nice perspective to kind of approach COVID, because I think we do get really used to our routines and don't really stop and think about that.
It is, you know, you really get ripped off in med school because the limited education that's given in response to mental health, you know, it's so equally important. And, you know, we really have to work together as a profession to start to bridge that gap, that chasm between mental health and physical health. Because when that barrier is there, it really, it's just a lack of understanding, a lack of education on how people are dealing with it, let alone ourselves, but our clients and our patients as well. Anyone else going once? What's been
Dr. Perkins,
yes?
Sorry, I just wanted to get your perspective on, you know, you talked about the interaction and human touch and all that, and of course, our whole world in terms of, you know, larger groups is like this on virtual. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? At least we can see people's faces and communicate that way in larger groups. But the transition back, I don't know. I'm just.
Oh, it's going to be difficult. You know, so taking your example, or taking people in the business world that have been working from home, if you've been isolated for that long a time, and now all of a sudden I'm put back in a group, oh, that's going to be extremely traumatizing, number one. And, you know, Zoom does not replace the social interaction. Very interesting. There are two, you know, for years, medical doctors and researchers have been trying to come up with predictability factors when it is associated with mortality rates of disease. And all of the research, decades and decades and decades and decades, they still say the same thing. There are two primary factors which will increase the mortality rate of someone who has a disease. The one is financial, and the financial is a sort of two-prong in the sense that, one, a person that's in a bad financial situation might not have access to health care, and or a poor financial situation will contribute to the stress, which will therein lower the immune rate, which will increase the mortality rate. That's number one. You know what the second one is? People who are self and socially isolated, people that don't have the ability of interaction one-on-one in person with other people. And the studies have shown that if one of these two factors is present, it increases the mortality rate by up to 30 to 35%, that a person will die from a particular disease if they weren't subjected to that. So, we really have to look at COVID too. And when we're saying, we've got social distancing, people are wearing masks, why are so many people still dying if we put all of these things in practice? And this is the mental impact and the stresses that are created by COVID. We really have to remember it lowers our immune system. When our body goes into this emergency mode, when the stress response is created, all of the normal things our body does, it just shuts down. I don't have to, my nails don't have to grow, my hair doesn't have to grow, my immunity, I'm not worried about that. I just need to survive. And we really have to take those things into consideration. So that's another stress. The fact that we're Zooming, that's great. But that doesn't replace that sort of that social interaction that's so important, that we've been used to our entire life. We've been used to physical touch our entire life. From the moment that we are born and our parents hold us, we've been used to that. And now, for the most part, certainly people that are married in families, but take single people. There's no physical contact going on. That is devastating. Never mind the physiological effect it has on the body, like the lack of oxytocin that's being produced and all of these things. That's a huge issue. That's a very good point.